Sarah Mitchell stared at the cabin rental confirmation on her phone screen, feeling her heart sink into her stomach because this was supposed to be their dream getaway, but the wooden structure before them looked nothing like the pristine photos online, and instead resembled something from a nightmare, with its rotting porch steps and broken shutters hanging like dead eyes in the fading daylight. Her husband Mark was already unloading their suitcases from the car, acting like everything was perfectly normal, even though Sarah could smell something wrong in the air, something thick and metallic that made her throat close up with fear. But she forced herself to smile because this vacation was supposed to save their marriage after months of fighting and cold silences that felt like living with a stranger. Key was hidden exactly where the owner had promised, under the third loose floorboard on the porch, and as Sarah bent down to retrieve it, she noticed dark stains between the wooden planks that looked suspiciously like dried blood. But she told herself it was just rust from old nails, because thinking anything else would drive her completely insane. Inside the cabin was worse than outside, with furniture covered in dusty white sheets that looked like ghostly figures in the dim light filtering through grimy windows, and there was that smell again, stronger now, like something had died and been left to rot in the walls for months or maybe years, and Sarah felt her skin crawl with invisible insects. Mark walked through the main room, pulling off dust covers and acting excited about their romantic getaway, but Sarah noticed how his hands shook slightly and how he avoided looking directly at the large dark stain on the wooden floor near the fireplace that was definitely not part of any rustic charm, and definitely looked like someone had bled out right there. On those very boards, the electricity worked, but barely, with lights flickering on and off like they were trying to communicate some desperate message, and the water from the kitchen tap ran brown for several minutes before clearing to a rusty orange that still looked unsafe to drink, and Sarah wondered what kind of place they had stumbled into, and why the rental price had been so impossibly cheap. As evening approached, the forest around them grew unnaturally quiet, with no bird songs or insect sounds, just an oppressive silence that pressed against the windows like something alive and hungry. And Sarah found herself checking the locks on the doors over and over again, even though she couldn't explain why she felt so terrified. Mark suggested they build a fire to make the place feel more cozy, but when he opened the fireplace damper, a shower of what looked like bone fragments and ash fell onto the hearth, along with a smell so putrid that Sarah ran outside and vomited behind the cabin, while her husband called after her, asking what was wrong, as if he couldn't smell the death that seemed to permeate every inch of this cursed place. When she came back inside, Mark was standing frozen in front of the fireplace, holding something in his trembling hands, and his face had gone completely white, like he'd seen a ghost or something much worse. And when Sarah asked what he'd found, he just stared at her with eyes full of terror and whispered that they needed to leave immediately. But as they rushed to pack their belongings, the sound of car engines filled the night air, growing closer and closer until headlights swept across the cabin windows, and Sarah realized with growing horror that whoever was coming wasn't there to help them. And the way Mark suddenly went completely still told her that he knew exactly who those people were and why they had really come to this godforsaken place. The engines stopped and car doors slammed shut, and heavy footsteps began climbing the rotting porch steps, while a man's voice called out Mark's name in a tone that promised nothing but pain. And Sarah finally understood that this wasn't a romantic getaway at all, but something much more sinister, and that her husband had brought her here for reasons she was only beginning to comprehend. Sarah's blood turned to ice water in her veins as she watched Mark's face transform from terrified husband to something cold and calculating that she had never seen before, and the realization hit her like a physical blow that the man she had loved and trusted for 8 years had deliberately brought her to this nightmare cabin for reasons that made her stomach twist with pure terror. Footsteps on the porch grew heavier and more deliberate, while voices outside discussed plans in low, threatening tones, and Sarah could make out at least 3 different men talking about timing and cleanup and making sure there were no witnesses left behind. And she knew with absolute certainty that they were talking About killing her, Mark grabbed her arm with fingers that dug into her flesh like claws, and his grip was so tight she could feel bruises forming. But when she tried to pull away, he held on tighter and whispered that she needed to stay calm and do exactly what he said if she wanted to survive the next few hours, and his voice carried a coldness that made her realize she had never really known him at all. Front door burst open without any attempt at stealth, and 3 men walked in like they owned the place, and Sarah recognized the tallest one as Danny Rodriguez, who had been Mark's business partner until their company went bankrupt 6 months ago, and now she understood why Mark had been so secretive about their financial problems and why he kept getting mysterious phone calls at all hours. Danny smiled at Sarah, but it was the kind of smile a shark gives before it attacks, and he told Mark that he had done good work bringing her here, because she was the only witness who could testify about the missing money and the falsified records, and now they could finally tie up all the loose ends permanently. Sarah tried to run toward the back door, but the second man caught her easily, and his hands were rough and calloused like someone who was used to hurting people, and he smelled like cigarettes and motor oil and something else that reminded her of the metallic scent that had been bothering her since they arrived at this cursed place. Mark started pleading with Danny, saying that Sarah didn't know anything about the embezzled funds and that killing her wasn't necessary, but Danny just laughed and said that Mark should have thought about consequences before he decided to steal $2 million from their clients and blame it on accounting errors. The third man was setting up some kind of equipment near the fireplace, and Sarah realized with growing horror that they had done this before in this very cabin, and that explained the bloodstains and the bone fragments and the overwhelming smell of death that seemed to seep from every surface. Danny explained to Mark that they had been using this place for years to handle business problems, and that the previous owner had been very accommodating until he became a problem himself and ended up feeding the forest animals and fertilizing the soil around the cabin. Sarah's mind raced as she tried to find some way to escape, but the cabin was surrounded by dense forest, and these men clearly knew the area well and had planned this execution down to the smallest detail, and she realized that Mark had been lying to her for months while setting up her murder. Man holding her started dragging her toward a chair that had rope already tied to its arms and legs, and Sarah knew that once they tied her down, her chances of survival would drop to zero, so she did the only thing she could think of and bit down on his hand as hard as she could until she tasted blood. He screamed and let go for just a second, but that was enough time for Sarah to grab a heavy brass candlestick from the mantel and swing it with all her strength at the nearest man's head, and the satisfying crack told her she had connected with something important. Chaos erupted in the small cabin as the injured man fell backward into Danny, who started cursing and reaching for something under his jacket, while Mark shouted at everyone to calm down. But Sarah was already moving toward the kitchen, where she had seen a back door earlier. She could hear them crashing through the cabin behind her, and Danny was yelling about how they should have just shot her immediately instead of trying to make it look like an accident, and that now they would have to hunt her through the forest like an animal. The back door was unlocked, and Sarah burst through it into the cold night air, but she could already hear them following, and she knew that running blindly into the dark forest was probably suicide, but staying in the cabin was definitely death, and at least in the woods she had a chance. As she crashed through the underbrush with branches tearing at her clothes and face, Sarah heard gunshots behind her and realized that they were no longer concerned about making her death look accidental, and now they just wanted her dead by any means necessary. Sarah's lungs burned like fire as she crashed through the dark forest with branches whipping across her face and drawing blood, while behind her the beam of flashlights swept back and forth like searching eyes, and she could hear Danny screaming at his men to spread out and find her before she reached the main road. The forest floor was treacherous, with hidden roots and fallen logs that sent her stumbling and falling every few steps, but the terror pumping through her veins kept her moving even when her knees scraped against rocks and her palms were torn open by thorns, and she tasted blood in her mouth from where she had bitten her tongue. She tried to move as quietly as possible, but every footstep seemed to echo through the trees like gunshots, and she knew they were getting closer because she could hear Mark's voice calling her name in a tone that was supposed to sound concerned and loving, but now made her skin crawl with revulsion. A gunshot cracked through the night air and bark exploded from a tree just inches from her head, and Sarah realized they weren't trying to capture her alive anymore, and that Mark had obviously told them she knew more about their criminal activities than she actually did. Her phone had no signal this deep in the forest, but the screen provided just enough light to help her avoid the biggest obstacles, and she tried to remember if she had seen any other cabins or houses during their drive up the mountain, but everything had been darkness and trees for miles. The voices behind her were spreading out now, with Danny going left and another man going right, while Mark continued straight, and Sarah understood that they were trying to box her in like hunters cornering a deer, and her only chance was to do something completely unexpected. She found a steep ravine that dropped down into what sounded like a creek, and even though climbing down in the dark was incredibly dangerous, it might be her only way to lose them. So she started scrambling down the rocky slope while loose stones cascaded around her. Halfway down, she lost her footing and fell hard against a boulder that knocked the wind out of her lungs and sent her phone spinning away into the darkness. But she could hear water running below and knew she had to keep moving, even if it meant crawling. The creek was ice cold and moved fast enough that she had to fight to keep her balance. But the sound of rushing water would mask her movement, and she hoped the current might carry away her scent if they brought dogs later. She followed the creek downstream for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, while the voices above grew fainter, and she began to hope that maybe she had actually escaped, until she saw a light ahead and realized it was coming from another building. The structure turned out to be an old hunting lodge that looked abandoned, but as Sarah got closer, she could see warm light glowing through the windows and smoke rising from the chimney, and she felt a surge of hope that maybe she had found help. She crept up to one of the windows and peered inside, expecting to see a family or hunters or anyone who might help her, but instead she saw Danny sitting at a wooden table talking on a satellite phone while maps and photographs were spread out in front of him. Her heart nearly stopped when she realized this was their base of operations, and that they had been planning this for much longer than she had imagined. And the photos on the table showed her house, her car, her daily routine, and even pictures of her at work and at the grocery store. Danny was telling someone on the phone that the witness had escaped into the forest, but that they had contingency plans and backup locations, and that the job would be completed before sunrise and there would be no loose ends left to cause problems. Sarah backed away from the window in horror, but her foot hit a metal bucket that clanged against the side of the building, and immediately the conversation inside stopped, and she heard Danny curse and tell his men to check the perimeter. She ran toward the forest again, but this time she heard dogs barking in the distance and knew that her chances of escape were dropping rapidly, and that they had been planning for every possibility, including the chance that she might run. The barking was getting closer, and Sarah knew that dogs would track her scent no matter how far or fast she ran. So she needed to find somewhere to hide or some way to throw them off her trail, and fast. She remembered reading somewhere that crossing water could confuse tracking dogs, so she waded back into the creek and started moving upstream toward higher ground, while the icy water numbed her legs and made every step agony. Sound of men shouting to each other was getting closer, and she could see flashlight beams sweeping through the trees, and Sarah realized that Mark was probably with them, telling them exactly how she thought and what she would do in this situation. Then she saw something that made her blood freeze, because there was another cabin ahead, built right next to the creek, and light was pouring from its windows. But this time she could see shadows moving inside, and she realized that this nightmare was much bigger than just Danny and his two partners. Sarah pressed herself against a massive pine tree as she watched the cabin ahead and counted at least 6 different shadows moving inside. while voices drifted through the night air, discussing search patterns and kill zones, and she realized, with growing terror, that this wasn't just about stolen money, but something much larger and more organized. Through the lit windows she could see men in tactical gear, studying maps and handling weapons, with the kind of professional efficiency that suggested military or law enforcement training, and Sarah understood that Mark hadn't just gotten involved with local criminals, but with people who made murder their business. Her teeth were chattering from the cold creek water, and her clothes were soaked through, but she forced herself to stay perfectly still as one of the men stepped outside and swept a high-powered flashlight across the forest while speaking into a radio about perimeter security and potential escape routes. The man's voice was calm and methodical as he reported that the target was still contained within the search area and that all exit points were covered, and Sarah felt her last hope of escape crumble as she realized they had turned the entire mountain into a trap. She heard Mark's voice from inside the cabin telling someone that Sarah was smarter than they had given her credit for, and that she might try to hide until daylight before attempting to reach the road, and his casual tone while discussing her murder made her stomach turn with rage and betrayal. A new voice joined the conversation, and Sarah recognized it as Detective James Morrison from the local police department, and she felt the world spin around her as she understood that even the authorities were part of this conspiracy, and that there was literally nowhere safe for her to run. Morrison was explaining to the group that they needed to make Sarah's death look like a hiking accident, and that her body should be found far enough from the cabin to avoid any connection to their operation, and he spoke about her murder like he was discussing weekend fishing plans. The pieces started falling into place in Sarah's mind as she remembered how Morrison had been the investigating officer when Mark's business partner had died in that suspicious car accident 6 months ago, and how quickly the case had been closed without any real investigation. She realized that this network probably extended throughout the local government and law enforcement, and that Mark had gotten involved with people whose criminal activities reached much deeper than simple embezzlement and fraud. One of the tactical men reported over the radio that the dogs had lost her scent at the creek, but that thermal imaging showed a heat signature near the pine grove. And Sarah felt her blood turn to ice as she understood they were talking about her exact location. She had maybe 30 seconds before they would be on top of her, so she did the only thing she could think of and pulled out her car keys and threw them as hard as she could into the forest, hoping the sound would draw them away from her position. Metallic jingle echoed through the trees, and immediately she heard voices calling out coordinates and flashlights swinging toward the sound, while boots crashed through the underbrush in that direction, and she used the distraction to move deeper into the shadows. But as she crept away from the cabin, she stepped on something soft that moved under her weight, and when she looked down, she saw the decomposing body of a woman about her own age, wearing hiking clothes and a wedding ring that caught the moonlight. Sarah bit her own hand to keep from screaming as she realized this was probably another victim who had discovered too much about their operation, and that her own body would end up in the same remote grave if she didn't find a way out of this nightmare. Dead woman's backpack was still intact, and Sarah carefully searched through it, finding a GPS device that showed their location was 12 miles from the nearest town, and that the only road out was completely controlled by the people hunting Hirsch. Also found a small digital camera, and when she turned it on, she saw dozens of photos showing the same men who were now hunting her, meeting with various officials and businessmen and exchanging briefcases full of cash and documents. The final photos on the camera showed this same woman hiding in the forest taking surveillance pictures of what looked like a drug processing operation in another cabin. And Sarah realized she had stumbled into something that involved millions of dollars and dozens of lives. Her hands shook as she removed the memory card from the camera and slipped it into her shoe, because if she died tonight, at least there would be evidence of what these people were doing, and maybe someday justice would find them. Voices were getting closer again, and Sarah could hear Morrison coordinating the search teams like a military operation. And she knew that her amateur attempts at hiding wouldn't fool these professionals for much longer. She looked at the dead woman's face one more time and made a silent promise that if she survived this night, she would make sure everyone involved paid for their crimes, no matter how powerful or connected they were. Then she heard Mark's voice much closer than before, telling someone that he knew exactly where Sarah would hide because he had studied her behavior patterns for months while planning this operation, and that she was probably less than 100 yards away. Sarah clutched the memory card in her shoe like a lifeline as Mark's voice grew closer, and she could hear him telling the search team about her childhood fear of heights and how she always chose ground-level hiding spots, which meant they should focus their search on the dense brush rather than the rocky outcroppings above. Irony wasn't lost on her that Mark's intimate knowledge of her fears and habits, which had once made her feel loved and understood, was now being used as a weapon to hunt her down like an animal, and she felt something hard and cold crystallize in her chest where her heart used to be. She forced herself to do the one thing Mark would never expect and started climbing up the steep, rocky face behind her, even though every instinct screamed against it, and her hands were so numb from cold that she could barely grip the stone ledges. The climb was terrifying, and several times she nearly fell when loose rocks gave way under her weight, but the sound of men crashing through the brush below drove her upward until she reached a narrow cave opening about 30 feet above the forest floor. Inside the cave, she found the skeletal remains of at least 3 more people, along with rotting backpacks and personal belongings, and she realized this mountain had been their killing ground for years, and that dozens of innocent people had probably died here. Phone suddenly buzzed with a weak signal, and without thinking she dialed 911, but when the dispatcher answered, she heard Detective Morrison's voice asking for her location and promising that help was on the way. And she hung up in terror, knowing the entire system was compromised. Instead, she called her sister, Lisa, in Seattle, and quickly whispered the GPS coordinates from the dead woman's device along with the name she had heard, and begged Lisa to contact the FBI and the state police and anyone who might be outside this corrupt network. Lisa was asking frantic questions, but Sarah had to hang up when she heard voices directly below the cave and realized that Mark was standing almost underneath her, telling someone that Sarah was definitely in this area because he could smell her perfume. She pressed herself deeper into the cave and tried to control her breathing while Mark continued his psychological warfare by calling up to her in that fake, loving voice, telling her that if she came down now, they would make it quick and painless. But then Morrison's radio crackled with an incoming message, and Sarah heard him curse as he reported that multiple federal vehicles were approaching the mountain access road and that their operation had been compromised. Chaos erupted below as Morrison started screaming orders about destroying evidence and evacuating personnel, while Mark kept insisting they had time to find Sarah and finish the job. Morrison told him the witness was no longer their primary concern. Sarah listened to them argue about whether to retreat or stand and fight, while vehicles roared to life and men ran in all directions, and she realized that Lisa had somehow managed to bring help despite the late hour. The sound of helicopters filled the night air, and powerful searchlights began sweeping across the forest, while amplified voices demanded that everyone on the mountain surrender immediately and come out with their hands visible from her cave. Sarah could see the entire network collapsing as men who had seemed so confident and organized just minutes before now ran through the forest like panicked animals, while federal agents closed in from multiple directions. Mark's voice rose above the chaos as he screamed her name one final time, but now it was filled with rage and desperation instead of fake concern, and Sarah felt a savage satisfaction knowing that his carefully planned murder scheme had destroyed his own life instead of hers. She waited until she saw Morrison being dragged away in handcuffs and Mark being thrown face first onto the hood of a federal vehicle before she finally climbed down from her rocky sanctuary on legs that shook so badly she could barely stand. Agent Sarah Chun of the FBI helped her down the final few feet and explained that her Sister's call had triggered an investigation that had been building for months, and that Sarah's testimony and the evidence she had found would finally bring down a criminal network that had operated with impunity for years. 6 months later, Sarah sat in the federal courthouse watching. Mark received 3 consecutive life sentences while Morrison and his corrupt colleagues were sentenced to death for their roles in at least 18 murders, and she felt something like peace settling over her. Damaged soul. The memory card had contained evidence that led to the arrests of 47 people, including judges, businessmen, and law enforcement officials across 3 states, and Sarah had become the key witness in the largest corruption case in the region's history. She had sold their house and moved across the country, where she worked with a victims advocacy group, helping other survivors of violent crimes. And though the nightmares still came sometimes, she had learned that survival wasn't just about escaping danger, but about finding meaning in the aftermath. On quiet evenings, she would think about the woman whose camera had provided the evidence to bring down the network, and she had made sure that all the victims found in those mountain caves received proper burials, and that their families finally knew what had happened to their loved ones. The end.